Before we launch into the finale of both the series on Gary Hamel and indeed the finale of the three-part episode on Humanocracy, I want to tell you there's a copy up for grabs. If you sign up to the Innovation Show or you go to the Substack and sign up, I'm giving away a copy of Humanocracy, the new edition, with each episode. And I want to thank our sponsor, Kindle. Kindle have just dropped their biannual journal that features many of the world's best thought leaders, including policy leaders, AI leaders, guests of the shows such as Rita McGrath, and you can find that at www.kindle.com/institute. Welcome back to the finale of both Humanocracy, the new edition has just dropped, and to this series on the tome of Gary Hamel.
Hey, Aidan, nice to be back.
I thought a great way to finish would be first to talk about why Humanocracy. Have we not learned any lessons about the bureaucracy and how it's weighing down organizations? Why at this point in economic growth are we talking about bureaucracy still? The second then is the Roche brilliant case study, and Roche showed dramatic results as a result of eliminating bureaucracy and more so leaning into humanocracy. And then finally, holding up the mirror to ourselves. How do we look at ourselves and decide, are we contributing to this? Are we contributing to what you call bureausclerosis? So they're the three things to get stuck into. The very first is, why are we still talking about this in the first place?
We talked about before, Aidan, that around the world, we see the growth of the bureaucratic class. The number of managers and administrators is growing far faster than all other employment categories. We've talked a little bit about why that is. What you see is, I might call it the epidemic of mediocrity. A growing number of global 1,000 companies are proving themselves unable to grow as fast as the GDP. And that's not stripping out all the mergers and acquisitions. If I look at the US, if I go back over the last decade, just the last decade in the United States, 55 out of the top 100 companies by revenue, 55, more than half, failed to grow as fast as GDP, which is not that high of a target. If you take the previous decade, like 2003 up to 2013, only 20% of companies failed to grow as fast as GDP. And when you look at the laggards, they're names that our viewers and our listeners around the world would recognize. Companies like Procter & Gamble, IBM, Walmart, Coca-Cola, Boeing, and so on. And many of these companies, in fact, virtually all of them, have spent over that last decade or so, have spent more money on deals and share buybacks than they've spent on R&D and capital investment. And so that's not very good when your organization can't grow as fast as the economy. Secondly, there's increasing data, or some very good data, from two researchers, Germain Gutierrez and Thomas Philippin, and they looked, Aidan, at what they call the American superstars. So these are the top companies by market value in the economy overall, and then the top companies by market value in each sector. And they found that over the last 20 years, the productivity of these companies has declined by 40%. And then actually what you would expect to be the bleeding edge of the U.S. economy, they are now a drag on productivity. And partly because all these organizations, all these companies are monopolies or oligopolies, but they're not necessarily all that productive. And recently, if you look at Microsoft and Meta and so on, they're all going through major rounds of layoffs, trying to correct that. Finally, and I think we have talked about this, but in this context, maybe worth coming back to this, is that around the world, large companies are becoming more entrenched. I don't think there's any more evidence that they're more resilient or creative or innovative, but they are becoming more entrenched and less likely to be disrupted. We looked at this in the US, where each year, going back to 2000, we took the top 100 companies by revenue, and then we asked for how many years had those companies been in that list of the top 100 going back a decade. So if you take the decade from ending in 2000, 45 of the top 100 U.S. companies had been on the list of the 100 for all of the previous 10 years, back to 1991. You run that now, starting in 2024, and 75% of them have been in the top 100 for every year going back to 2015. So as these companies become more entrenched, and we just saw they're not very dynamic, the whole economy loses its dynamism. And you see this around the world because these companies are just getting bigger. They have a lot of political power and so on. So yeah, I think there's definitely a reason to be concerned that this problem is not getting any better and that we're going to have to dig deep and have a pretty solid commitment to changing this if we want to reverse the productivity slump, if we want to have faster growing economies, and if we just want to have like more choices as consumers and more innovation and so on. It's not good when companies are so deeply entrenched that they can take the consumer for granted and don't really have to compete. So yeah, I don't think we've yet reached the turning point on this.
So we still have a problem. But the good news is, and you alluded to this many times throughout the series, there are chinks of light and big companies that have a legacy, who have been around for a very long time, who have managed to do this. And it didn't happen overnight. That's a big piece of this. But for the skeptics who are kind of going, yeah, that's all good for them, it isn't easy, but the returns are massive. And I want to talk here directly to the CEOs. The impact of Roche's transformation has been remarkable. In 2023, Genentech's revenues were 24% higher than they'd been 5 years earlier, and ROI was up 27% despite a patent cliff. This remarkable result was achieved with 22% fewer people, the result in part of a deep commitment to delayering that Gary talked about throughout this series. The changes in Pharma International have been equally dramatic. The changes freed up $3 billion per year, which Roche have put into R&D, which is just an incredible endorsement for the transformation. And I'd love you to take us through this. Maybe give us a little bit of a history. Gary, you've done hundreds of hours of interviews with the executives involved, but also you've discovered this brilliant case study, which has led to the new edition of the book as well.
So Roche is, I think, now the second largest pharma company in the world. They have about 150,000 employees in 156 countries. So obviously a very large, very complex company. Often when I'm talking about these issues, Aidan, the pushback is, well, we have all this bureaucracy because of regulation. Well, pharmaceuticals is one of the most highly regulated industries in the world. And even there, when Roche began to dig into things, they found that at least 3/4 of kind of the excess bureaucracy had nothing to do with external regulation. It was all kind of self-imposed, self-inflicted. Like every big pharma company over recent years, they faced a whole bunch of challenges. Around the world, healthcare authorities are basically going bankrupt as the cost of medicine goes up. They've had a swarm of new biotech competitors. About between 2/3 and 3/4 of all new drugs coming to market now are invented by relatively small organizations. And back in 2016-17, Roche was really feeling these pressures. And adding to that was the fact that three of their biggest drugs, which were bringing in about $22 billion a year, were going to go off patent within the next few years, what they call a patent cliff. They were also undergoing a shift from, in their portfolio, they historically been very strong in cancer drugs and oncology. They were beginning to move to other drug categories, more therapeutic drugs, for example, for multiple sclerosis, which meant that you were treating chronic conditions and had to have a completely different level of patient support over, could be multiple years. And so all of this, they realized that like more of the same was not going to cut it. And I just want to back up for a moment because this situation is not unique. Every company out there is living on borrowed time. If you have the guts to like face the future as it is, to really unpack what's our existing economic model, what's driving our revenue, whatever, and you're willing to be honest about that, I can guarantee you're going to see a lot of those things are running out of steam and you have to start working now. I think about where the German economy is right now, where they've had now a dozen years of rapidly declining, flattening, now negative productivity growth, and they're struggling to get themselves back on track. And yet, if you go back, you look highly dependent on Russian energy. How long is that going to last? Highly dependent on the Chinese consumer. That may not like. So, if you're willing to be honest about where you sit as an organization, there will always be, it doesn't have to be an incipient crisis, but there will always be a real urgency that you should have, just given the kind of chaotic complex nature of our environment. So they could see that coming. And I think what made it really unique is at that time, Bill Anderson, who was, I think as the story begins, is the CEO of Genentech. So that is literally the world's first biotech company, a California company. He was a CEO there. I'd spoken at Genentech multiple times about the issues we're talking about here. And I'd met Bill, and he was super unique in the sense that he was not satisfied with half measures. He wasn't satisfied with, hey, let's put another plaster on this, or let's go through another round of restructuring or another round of process improvement. And I might have mentioned earlier in the series, one of the things he said, which takes a lot of humility and a lot of guts, which very few leaders are willing to say, he said, I had to conclude that there was a problem with the whole system. Because they had been working, by this time, they've been working for multiple years on trying to embed the principles of agile, which is a super good thing to do. This is obviously a very smart company filled with PhDs and smart people, obviously highly motivated to do the right thing for patients. And despite that, he said, people were telling me they could not get things done. We were too slow, too inwardly focused, and so on. So the process really starts with a big leadership reboot, 2017 and 18. And their HR head at the time led this. And there was a program called Kinesis. And they started by bringing a few hundred of the top leaders together, and then it went out from there. And they brought them together about 25 at a time. But what they were really asking is, if we want to build a faster, more vital, more resilient organization, what needs to change in what we do as leaders? And I don't know how often leaders step back and really say, hey, maybe the problem is us, or maybe before we can ask the organization to change, we have to change in some deep fundamental level, but probably not often enough. So they did peer assessments among the leaders. And the question they were basically trying to get at is, like, how as a leader do you have impact? Where do you spend your time? How do you think you succeed in the role of being a leader? And there are basically kind of two dimensions to this, like four quadrants, Aidan. One was, how much of your time do you spend kind of in task mode, just working on specific tasks? How much of your time do you spend in relationship mode, where you're mentoring and encouraging and so on? So that was one. Are you task focused or relationship focused? The other dimension was, do you spend most of your time reacting, right? Emergencies, problems coming in, you're in basket, or do you spend more time kind of creating, looking forward, building capability, and so on? And so if you think about those, task versus relationship, reacting versus creating, obviously these assessments, when you unpack them, most of their leadership team was in that task orientation, reacting mode, which, like, all of us are in that mode a lot of the time. You got to get stuff done. But what I think, there are a couple of epiphanies for them. One is, hey, we have a lot of good people in this company who can get work done and can respond to emergencies and so on. That is not our job. Our job is not to be down in kind of that managing, administrating space. We're supposed to be looking out to the future and building new capabilities. There was also recognition that being in that space ultimately exhausts you. When you have a very large and complex company and you're sitting at the top, the number of issues, problems, and so on you have to worry about is literally like close to infinite. And so all these people, these leaders, they're working 12, 15-hour days, and yet they never can seem to be on top of things. They're perpetually exhausted because they're just trying to do too much. So I think that was, and after this assessment, as they bring these groups of 25 or so together, they lay out this grid. It was in a circle form, but these quadrants, they lay that out in a big kind of map on the ground. And they asked people to go stand in the space that represented how their peers viewed them. And of course, pretty much everybody ends up in that kind of managing space and not in kind of the leading space. So I think, there was a lot of insight that was driven there. Now, again, what I think was very different about what they did, and a testament to the perseverance at Roche, and you cannot overemphasize that word of perseverance. They recognized that changing the way they showed up for the organization, prototyping their future selves, getting out of that kind of managing box, that was going to take a lot of work. And they had to change the way they thought about their jobs. They had to change the way they interacted with their teams. They had to change some of their habits. Let me ask the really tough questions and intervene and show that I'm in control and give orders. And that wasn't going to happen overnight. So both in Genentech, which represents Roche in the United States, and then in their international pharmaceutical business, these leaders spent multiple days together over the course of the next year, kind of thinking about what do we change. And that activity had a few things. One is outlining some first steps that they could take, little things that they could do that kind of put them on this path of changing their role. For example, just learning to ask a lot more questions in meetings, learning to not make a decision right away, learning to push decisions back down, and so on. And so they would all commit to doing that. They'd go out for a week or two. They'd work on that. They'd come back together. They'd talk about, how's that going? What's difficult? What am I having to learn? So that was very much part of what they did. They also spend a lot of time in that first year thinking about what are the principles around which we want to reinvent our organization. And I argue before, Aidan, in our conversations, that you get to a point in any organization, any field, where you can't solve the new problems with the old principles. And I think Roche, to their credit, they realize that. They realize you have to go back to the level of principles. It's not about, well, let's just find another practice or let's do another reorg. It's like, no. We have to start with a whole different set of principles that are not based on bureaucratic thinking of everything has to be perfect and control is exerted from above and everybody spends most of their energy kind of reporting to a manager and figuring out what they want. So the initial set of principles they came out with, and this evolved over time, but the first principle, which is also the first principle in humanocracies, everyone needs to think and act like an owner. And that means you have to have autonomy, you have to have decision rights, you have to understand the business in kind of a holographic way rather than in a narrow functional way. But that was number one. And they knew that if they didn't get that right, nothing else happens. Number two was everybody needs to be relentlessly patient focused. And that for them was way more than just saying, yeah, obviously we take care of patients and we got to kind of think about that. In most organizations, it would only be salespeople, or in this case, the people who interact with physicians and medical affairs, who would really be explicitly every day thinking about the patient. And Roche wanted to change that. Just as at Hire, they wanted everybody to have a patient-facing role. And where this would evolve to is they began to look at every single activity across the company and ask, is this really making a difference for patients? And if it wasn't, like, why are we doing this? There better be a really, really good justification, because if you can't draw a line, whatever your function, whatever your role, if you cannot draw a direct line between what you're doing, not like some squiggly line of maybe it will impact it and maybe one day, and if you can't draw a fairly direct line between what you're doing and how it makes lives better for patients, why the heck are we doing this? So that was the second principle. The third principle, again, easy to state, but spent a lot of time working this through, was I need to be able to partner well with colleagues. So I think and act like an owner, I'm relentlessly patient focused, and I partner well with colleagues. Now, behind that was a recognition that they wanted to build an organization that was far more lateral than vertical. And so, fewer layers, but much denser connections around, people who are working on the same disease categories around the world in all of their country organizations. How do we share all that learning? How do we accelerate the pace of improvement? And that means we have to be able to partner well. And then the fourth principle is I'm empowered and act decisively. And that was really around the fact that everybody needs to step up. You need to be able to take personal risks in your career. You cannot delegate up. You cannot wait for somebody to tell you, that just slows everything down. We have to have people who are action oriented and move at a high tempo. So there was about a year or so more where that was the work of the leadership team. And they did it slightly differently between the US and Europe. I think in the US, maybe they were spending one day to get together every week. In Europe, maybe it was a day every fortnight or so on. But you think of the typical leadership team in any business, small, medium, or large, how much time do they actually spend together in a week or a month? And it's actually not very much. And here they were saying, like, guys, this is big work. It's not work that any one of us can do alone, right? This is like going to be so emotionally, intellectually, personally challenging. Like, we got to link up arms, do this together, and so on. And out of this came a fundamental redefinition of the senior team. In Roche in Pharma International, I believe that I'm sure that the top leaders, the business was led by wonderful Irishman Porrick Ward. They abandoned their titles, the top half a dozen people, and they said, we're now going to be part of a larger international network enabling team where we will, our role is enabling, not controlling. Huge shift in the mindset. And they wanted to be more like a community than like the top of the pyramid. So the way they got started in both the US and in Europe, they had design teams coming together. These were teams that 10 or 12 people that had been drawn from across the organization. They represented a diagonal slice of the organization. In putting together those teams, they were super conscious about making sure all the various aspects of the business were represented. And again, the teams did their work slightly differently. I'll maybe give you an amalgam, but the teams would come together. I believe for the start, it was a couple of weeks in a hotel room, like just working on, okay, how do you translate these principles into action? And the work of those teams was very transparent. So even when they're holed up in a hotel room getting started on this, daily they're reaching out to colleagues. Does this make sense? What do you think? This is the conversation we had today. Are we on the right track? They would hold kind of town halls where anybody could dial in and ask questions and comment as the team was doing the work. They would put up kind of quick pulse polls to test ideas. People reflecting back on this process said it was by far the most transparent and engaging change process ever in the history of Roche. And, that is absolutely critical in reducing the elapsed time for making real change. Because if people know what you're thinking about, what problems you're trying to solve, what alternatives you're looking at, how did you get to these answers, where you end up is way more credible and understandable than if some team is working in a black box and go like, surprise, here's like what we're going to do next as an organization. So very, very transparent. Roche had been fairly functionally organized, and a lot of kind of powerful top-level functions related to the drug industry around medical affairs, patient access, digitization, and so on. And so they wanted to kind of break those functional silos up. So they created what they called I squads. These were teams of about a dozen people, could be more. There were only 2 or 3 that were really permanent at the head of that I squad, and everybody else was just a member of that team. The head of the I squad, each I squad is built around a therapeutic class, a category of drugs, 1 or more drugs. But the point was, we are now all mutually and severally responsible for the results of this business. It had been that the sales team, the commercial team, which had before been the kind of the core of the business, they were responsible for results, but all these functions around them were really responsible for other things, for helping out or building programs or providing data, which may or may not be actually helpful to those teams. And so part of what they did in forming the I squads, they said more or less explicitly, we want to kind of shift the matrix. We want to, I don't want to say blow up, but we in some sense want to disaggregate those functions. And we're going to put all of those functional people onto these I squad teams. So now my primary responsibility is to a business team, not to my function. The function still existed. They would still get together. Another critical thing they did fairly early on is all of the functions. Now imagine as a corollary, imagine the kind of HR and accounting and IT and finance, whatever, show up in front of like line people running the business and say, here's what we're doing, here's where we're investing, like how much of this is useful. Well, that happened at Roche, where all these functions had to come and present to these business-focused teams, these I squads, and say, this is our roadmap, these are the capabilities we're building, do you want to buy this or not? So it really became a two-sided market where if the people actually trying to deliver benefit to the customers could not find value in a lot of that functional activity, they just they quit that. A very critical move was at one point they blew up all the international divisions. So they had added divisions in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Asia, and Latin America, and so on. They disbanded those. Several, I think close to 1,000 people were moved out of those roles. They said that's just like another layer of accounting consolidation, and we're just mimicking what's going on at head office anyway. So they got rid of that. But to ensure that there was a lot of coordination and collaboration, they established, I'm going to see if I can remember, I think it was called the Network Enabling Office. I'll probably have this wrong, so apologies. But essentially what they did was they created a team drawn from around the world of around 50 people who were responsible for looking at opportunities for collaboration across geographies. And they had sparkers within those teams who were supposed to find these opportunities, spark conversations, and then get lateral teams set up. So, for example, you might find multiple countries who are working to improve access to breast cancer screening. And so they'd find that, put these teams together, and then those teams would work on a shared problem. So the goal was, how do we, rather than being another layer and trying to direct all the country organizations, how do we create a team that will look for shared problems and energize those teams to come up with solutions? That was like an enormous change. And by the way, Aidan, many of these things, they all took time. They didn't take like a lot of resources. It wasn't that, the teams were relatively small. They'd come together for a couple of weeks, the design teams, they'd work on this. They'd go back into the organization, have a lot more conversations. Are we on the right path? Would come back, have another round. And so a lot of the things like the I squads and these ideas came out of these design teams. But they were working explicitly on the management model and every aspect of that in a way that very seldom happens. So other things that came out of this was outcome-based planning. And so they started to realize that they were, as many organizations do, they were spending an enormous amount of time every year kind of building up forecasts, doing plannings, going up and down the pyramid to try to get alignment and out for the next 12 months and beyond. And it just didn't make any difference. Nobody paid any attention to it. It was like basically a huge waste of time. And so for a bit, they experimented with no planning at all. That didn't seem to be the right answer. But what they ended up was something they call outcome-based planning. And it works in kind of a simple way. Each year, the senior team of Roche Pharma, and again, through a lot of consultation and listening, will identify what they think are 3 or 4 big themes, big areas for improvement, areas where they need to move forward as they're running the business. And they do not try to put plans. They don't roll out some change process around those, but they just let people know these are the things that are going to be really important. And then every country organization, every affiliate is charged with turning those into 90-day sprints, 90-day plans. So if we take this seriously, what do we do over the next 90 days to move in that direction? And how will we measure our outcomes? And so you imagine over many countries, all of those outcome-based plans are online and transparent, and everybody can see, oh, that's how they're dealing it, or that isn't that interesting, their idea. Let's collaborate on that and work on that together. And so rather than having kind of this accounting exercise, budgeting exercise that you paid attention to, it's now a very fast pace of 90 or 100-day sprints where everybody's reporting to everybody else. We know the progress we're making. And so just the clock speed of the whole organization picked up a lot. One of the other very important changes they made was in how they allocate resources. So as you'd know, in many organizations, in the budgeting process, different businesses, geographies, they compete for budget. You have a budget. That's now your money for the year. Maybe you can get a little more, but you're sure as hell going to spend everything you have. And you're going to hang on to it and you're going to protect it. And these are my people. This is my money. That makes it extraordinarily difficult to reallocate talent and capital as the world changes, which it inevitably does. So where Roche ended up on this was something called signals and sources. And the way it works is this. All of those leaders of the I squads, the people running all the big product, the drug categories, they get together every month and they review the performance of every single business that's represented there. So not a business reviewing with a boss, but these are peers, all these businesses reviewing with each other and looking at and also prioritizing opportunities. So a very critical part of that meeting, and it's backed up by finance people, but it's for them to identify and rank the top 10 opportunities for Roche over the next month or so. So where do we see an opportunity to grow this drug, or where do we see a challenge? And then they look at where the resources are. So someone might say, you know what, I have this great opportunity to grow my market with this particular drug. We're really short on training resources. Somebody else might say, you know what, I have $500,000 excess trading budget that I'm not going to need or would be better spent here. And the ethos is nobody owns resources. They're owned collectively, or we all own resources. They're owned collectively. And our job as a senior team is not to fight our corner, protect our budget. Our job is to get the resources behind the biggest opportunities as quickly as possible. So it is a huge kind of antidote to parochialism. By the way, they're all paid in the same way based on company success. So huge antidote to parochialism. And again, I've said this, I don't know, Aidan, for a good part of my career. It amazes me that in most middle or large organizations, if I went around the people running the business, running the product lines, the geography, and I said, what are the 5 or 6 largest opportunities for your company? I would not get the same list. Well, I know what I'm doing. I know it's important here. Like, that's just like bogus, because you have to understand the list for the whole institution. So you move resources behind those things. And again, the ethos is once we understand what those are, if somebody like a number 1, number 2 opportunity comes to me anywhere in the organization, says, hey, Gary, I need some help, it's incumbent on me to deliver that help rather than say, it's not my problem, I'm already too busy, I can't do it. So that was a huge step to creating a much more resilient organization that can redeploy resources much faster. So as you say, a very deep change process. Elapsed time we covered now is about 3 to 4 years. You talked about the results earlier. Now, because of the patent cliff, I think, and general pressures on pharma, I don't think their share price has made a whole lot of progress over that time. But again, being resilient doesn't always mean you're going to be able to deliver above average growth. There's sometimes things going on in the environment which you simply, they're just going to be a drag on your business, and you do your best. Or you will sell off a business that's underperforming and it's just like no longer fits with your portfolio. So I think the success is the fact that they coped with an enormous hit to the revenue line and end up with profits are up, growth is way up, headcount is way down. They didn't go into any mass layoffs, but they certainly learned how to do a lot more with less. So, it's hard for me to argue that if you can do it in a company with 156 affiliates around the world and regulators in every country, that you can't do this in whatever business you're in.
It's an incredible story, and I love, man. This is why I love talking to you. You recalled all of that because you did all the work. You had no researcher going doing the work for you. You did it yourself, and you got everything right. By the way, there, the
Okay,
neo,
that's good because I'm not looking at my notes or anything else.
I
So.
know it's brilliant. It's brilliant, and I just wanted to bring it back because one of the things I always have to remind myself here is if you're a CEO, we've loads of CEOs listening to the show, you're looking at this and going, oh my God, that's a lot of work. And we're not masking it. It is a lot of work. And like Gary said, first, like, I just want to strip it right back, as you say, to the studs. From the background, this means putting budget in place. And you and I, Gary, like, I'm following in your footsteps, but I work as a consultant. And oftentimes, when you're saying you need to do more work, they think you're trying to sell. And you're kind of going, no, this takes massive persistence. As you said here, 25% of time allocated by senior people in the organization. And one of the lines I pulled out was from the Irishman, Porrick Ward, who's now head of Roche Pharma Europe and International. He said the work of reshaping leadership roles and behaviors was immensely time consuming. And he actually went too far to say, he felt it was a bit of a pain. This was really time consuming for him, and they wondered where the value would be. And I just wanted to point to that, the two things there, the willingness. So you're Roche, you acquire in 1990, I think it was Genentech. Anderson's the CEO. Then he then says, okay, well, if you want me to do this, I'm going to do it my way. I need huge amount of resources. And maybe he didn't say that up front, but then the company did it and they got behind it. And that rarely happens because that takes such a shift of mindset in a
Yeah.
company.
Well, and I want to say, I would only caveat that with a couple of things. Well, maybe one thing. The real resource that drove this was the energy and the time of the senior team. And yes, the design teams would go away. And I think ultimately, and they didn't start them all at the same time. They were staggered. I think they ultimately had eight or nine of those design teams. And given the size of the organization, and given that you're spending, billions and billions of dollars a year on R&D and so on, this wasn't enough of a financial investment to probably be a decimal place within Roche. But it was a commitment of senior people. It was a challenging and difficult thing for them to go through. So you've heard me say before, when I look at a change process like this, I always describe it as revolutionary goals and evolutionary steps. And one of the change leaders in this process said, we knew we'd have to go back to the studs, meaning back to the framing. I think I mentioned that in our last conversation. But, at one level, that sounds like incredibly scary. Like, what? The image is a road that somebody's pulled up and we're doing construction and the road's not passable for the next 9 months, right? Like, that's when you say we got to go back. But it didn't happen that way. The business is running, they're succeeding, they're selling. And everything that came out of this, they tried as an experiment, right? It wasn't like, okay, let's redo this for the whole company. And I think there's a thought, I've heard some at Roche say, well, it would have been better if we had this more planned out up front. It would have been better if Europe and US were more connected, or international US were more connected on this. Yes and no. I think the fact that they didn't try to predetermine it meant they got much more creative solutions. The fact that they let some parallel streams run to see what's really going to work. So in any kind of change process, you want to diverge before you converge. And ultimately, let's find the best way and let's try to replicate that. But don't believe that you have to roll something out from the start that looks the same everywhere, because you've just lost an enormous amount of learning opportunity when you do that. And I think they had, by luck or by wisdom, they let that thing play out that way. So step by step, nothing blew up, no big operational disasters, no regulatory problems, but the perseverance and recognizing that, in the end, we will change everything, right? Not right away, not in ways that blow up the system, but so that was, I think, what makes this kind of unique story, equivalent to what happened at Hire, perhaps not quite as radical, but in a Western context.
And one of the things we talked about was that over time, somebody makes it up. Somebody made up the systems that we live with today. Somebody made them up at a certain period of time. You talked about in a previous episode, John Locke, for example. He just made it up, and then we all are stuck with these things. And really, that's what I took from this, is that they made up these ways of working. And one of the ones I just really wanted to double click on before we move on to looking in the mirror for ourselves is the cross-functional squads. You mentioned the I squad, which the I stands for integrated, but there was first the squad, and how that took a massive mindset shift across the organization to go, you're no longer a department, you're now a squad working together from different departments to take on a certain challenge or look at a point of bureaucracy and go, we're going to eradicate that. I'd love you just to explain that a little bit, because maybe that's something people can take away.
Yeah. Now, at one level, what they did has been done before. I mean, they were essentially moving from very much a functional organization where you had commercial and sales and staff functions to one that was around these I squads, these integrated business units. In years past, Honda and Toyota did things like that. The auto companies used to be highly, highly functionally organized, and then they started organizing them around models and so on. You had engineering and finance and so on, all on the same page. So in that sense, you could argue, okay, maybe some other organizations have done this. But I think the deeper principle there is recognizing that if what you want is collaboration, if you want the best possible outcomes, that is not going to happen through centralization. It's going to happen through more laterality, more collaboration, everybody having the same information, everybody going after the same targets. And so I think that was that was definitely the breakthrough there. So in any organization, you'll find silos. I mean, you can reorganize, but you just end up with the silos running in a different direction. So the question is, how do you build a more lateral organization? And for that, as we talked about, I think with Nucor, there's just no substitute for FaceTime. There's no substitute for transparency of information. There's no substitute for having all focused on the same targets and spending enough time together so you build reciprocity and trust. So yeah, that was a very difficult thing for them to do, but I think it was something that was ultimately necessary. So yeah, I don't want to say that what Roche did is the one way of doing this, because what you have to take out of here is the principles around, hey, if the leaders do not change their roles and the way they show up, you're going to be stuck. If I continue to behave as a bureaucrat and in that command control model rather than engage in an enable model, that's going to trickle down. Like, don't expect empowerment, don't expect rapid change. If everything has to come up to get approval, we're just stuck. So I think that's a key thought here is it in the best circumstances, it does start at the top. I think secondly, the perseverance that this is required. We've talked about that, the humility that's required, the fact that this is something that kind of rolls out, it is not something that rolls down, that the redesign is very creative and very experimental, in all ways, pretty much the opposite of a traditional change program.
That idea of one budget, and also the relinquishing of power, as you talked about in previous episodes, showed great humility by the leadership team as well. I thought that was such a huge thing, that even getting that into an organization where there's a shared bonus, not only a shared budget, but a shared bonus system. And that was pushed by senior leaders as well.
Yeah, I would describe it, as you talk about it, Aidan, it is in some ways relinquishing power. But certainly for senior leaders, I would describe it as trading formal authority for business impact. So I have less formal authority. I'm not weighing in on everything. I'm pushing decisions down, but I will end up having a lot more impact ultimately. And again, this was something that the leaders recognized fairly early on. There was this concern that, like, if we're not exercising oversight, if we're not on top of everything, if we don't know everything, like, things could go crappy. And they're like, wait. The real problem we have as an organization, it's not that if we take our eye off the ball, everybody else. No, the real problem is we're just going to keep doing the same thing, and everybody's going to do the same. Like, we have an excess of control, not an absence of control. So we can step back. So I think they recognize that ultimately our impact is going to come from building a better organization, not every day building a better business, if you see that distinction, right? From creating more empowerment, from creating more patient focus, from creating more laterality, from accelerating the pace of decision making, from developing skills lower down. So they really, and I've said this for years, they shifted their role from kind of being executives to being architects, where we have to architect the future of the organization.
One last thing on it before we conclude with the personal accountability is a turning point was when they actually became patient-centric. And you talked about Ward, for example, Porrick Ward and his senior colleagues spending several hours listening to patient calls, listening to the real problems. And again, it's something that you assume happens in many organizations. And this led to what you call PJPs, patient journey partners, and health system partners, where people were actually just focused on that. They dealt with bureaucracy and now they were dealing with the patient journey.
I think through the whole process, that was kind of the catalyst for everything they did. One of the attitudes they struggle with, obviously, when you're working with human health, the consequences are very dire if you get it wrong. And you do need a lot of you need to make sure you're absolutely right. But that thing of, making sure the right patient gets the right drug at the right time, it metastasized, and it's just like this general thing of you got to review everything, look at everything, you can't ever try anything. And so they kind of subtly, they knew that in a drug company, the idea that you need to take risks, that was probably never going to be a message that would land. Like, what? So instead of saying you need to take risks, what they said is our patients can't wait, right? We got to move faster, we got to do better because our patients can't wait. But yes, and they reorganized all the physician and patient-facing roles, and I mean, you reflect. We've talked about this. You reflect on your own experience being on one of these 7-level phone trees, and you're on the 29-minute hold. And by the way, will you please download our app? And all the hurdles they put in the way. Like, how many CEOs of these companies have actually been on gone through this, understood what the hell they're subjecting their people to? And so, yeah, they made a lot of investment in that area, which, the book talks about exactly what they did there. But, and also one thing we should talk about fairly, and I might have mentioned this, but quite early in the process, I think when when Bill Anderson moved into the global role from Genentech CEO, and I think that was 2019, they articulated a new vision for Roche Pharma, which was to have 3 times the patient impact for 50% of the cost. Now, a bureaucrat is never going to articulate that kind of a target because somebody might actually hold you the hell accountable. But you do need to be able to distinguish between the target that you are going to achieve this month, this quarter, whatever, and as a do or die, and a target that is something that is aspirational. So Elon Musk can say, let's get somebody to Mars, but he's not saying I'm going to do it this week or this year, right? So I think by articulating that vision, they realize if we want to make any progress towards that, everything has to change, right? That's a 6x, three times impact, half a cost, 6x, and very few organizations have anything like that aspirational goal. I've probably said before, but no business outperforms its aspirations. And so if you don't have the courage to kind of set those kinds of goals that motivate people, now there has to be a logic behind it. It's not like, hey, let's just all work harder and kill ourselves. No. The logic is we got a world that is aging population, needs more healthcare. It's currently unaffordable. So you have to find something that's logical. But if you don't have the guts to kind of articulate that and pin your flag to that, what the hell are you doing as a CEO or as a leader?
As you said before, ambition deficit disorder is rife in most organizations. Let's finish with this last piece, which is looking at yourself. And actually, when I read through this, I was guilty of a few of those things myself when I worked in organizations where it's like, have you got a secret bit of schadenfreude that the guy next door is failing because it makes you look a bit better, etc. There's loads of things you talk about in the final chapter as well.
Let me just say 2 things that are really important, because it is so easy to just be tranquilized by the status quo, to just believe what could be done, I give up, and so on. And it's very easy to feel, and all of us have had, believe me, I feel that way in the organizations that I'm part of. You can feel like you're this mouse caught in the maze of bureaucracy, and so many people, you got to get their sign off and get their approval. It takes so long, and you just go, oh, heck, I'm not going to bother. But I think, and so that's a fair reaction, but I think honesty also requires us to say, it's not just that the mouse is in the maze. It's also true to say that the maze is in the mouse. That if you've lived in that kind of an organization, a fairly bureaucratic organization for a long time, you just, not only do you believe that's the only way to do things, but you have no energy kind of to try to change that. And if you think like a bureaucrat, every new problem, every new issue requires more staffers, more metrics, more standards, more oversight, more whatever. So I think you have to be willing to, say, I am not going to perpetuate a system that is no longer working for our stakeholders and for our employees. I cannot live with myself if I'm perpetuating something that really isn't the very best thing for everybody here. And number 2, you have to say, and I'm willing to start with me, right? Rather than say, man, we have all these screwed up systems, I got to start with me. So I call this kind of 12-step for bureaucrats, or personal recovery for bureaucrats. And it simply means recognizing when you're operating out of the old bureaucratic mindset. When in the course of a week or a month, you do things that reflect a lack of faith in quite competent people around you. You do things that are more about holding on to power and prestige than maybe sharing it and letting other people grow. That you kind of pad a budget, or you overinflate an argument because that's the only way you're going to get some resources, or you sit there with a superior and you don't challenge them on something that you think is wrong or where they're going in the wrong direction. So in the book, we list out quite a few of these, and our recommendation is, hey, at the end of every week, step back, go through this and ask, where am I still operating out of that bureaucratic mindset? Maybe find a few peers and have that same conversation. So it's a little less it's not just about me. It's okay, yeah, we all. And critically, when you see something there that you don't like, I'm sacrificing my values for expediency. The question you want to ask is, what in the organization is rewarding that and pushing us to do that? Because it's probably not really about you. I have a friend, Bob Sutton at Stanford. He wrote a book many years ago called The No Asshole Rule, But the dilemma is bureaucracy turns everybody into an asshole. And so recognizing that, and then ultimately going to your team and saying, guys, I want to support you in the way that maximizes your achievement, your capacity. So here's what I'm trying to avoid. When you guys catch me doing this, like raise a hand and say, Gary, not so helpful, right? I thought you wanted to do it differently. So you do have to have, just like you would in a 12-step program, if you're wrestling with an addiction, you need accountability partners with this. But, as in recovery, an early starting point is to do the inventory of yourself. So that we lay a lot of that stuff out in the book. The other part, Aidan, is to recognize the power of just like starting to hack the system where you are. And it can seem very hard. I don't own the talent process. I don't own the resource allocation process. Like, what the heck do I do? And so it's always somebody else's problem. So we spend a lot of time, more, I think an entire chapter, maybe more, talking about how do you build a hack in your part of the organization. And we might have talked about some of these along the way, but it's basically saying, how do I bring a few of my team together, start to think about an important set of questions you can ask each other, which Roche spent a lot of time, and we didn't talk about this, they spent a lot of time talking to employees and asking what gets in the way of achievement. So where does your work not get recognized? What makes collaboration difficult? What are the tasks that we give you that just you don't think add any value? Where do you fear doing something because of consequences? So you start to ask people, what is getting in the way of you doing the very best job? And again, we kind of outline how to do that, and then go, okay, what would I change to do that? Let me just give one example of a hack. So this is a couple of mid to upper mid-level people in a large organization who, and this was actually happened in a program at the London Business School, like advertisement just recently rated the #1 executive education in the world, and I teach on their capstone program. So that's my little advertisement for the day. But we had a team at the London Business School, and these senior executives are very frustrated about the company's travel policies. And they had a regime in which somebody told you which airline to fly on. They told you which hotels you could stay in. They told you how much you could spend every day on food and so on. And I remember somebody saying, I run a $70 million business, and like I have to get somebody to prove like what I pay for coffee. Like, this is just so nonsensical, I can't believe it. So again, what do you do? Even if you're mid to senior, like, how do I change that? So together, a few of them said, let's run an experiment. And we'll take a little bit of heat, maybe if things go wrong, but it's not anything that will blow up the company. So they found a group of 100 people within a business, 100 people at head office, and then they divided those into teams of 50. So now I have 4 teams of 50. They said, we're going to take 2 of those teams, and we changed nothing. You still have all the travel rules. But 2 of the teams, 50 each, for the next, I think it was 30, 60 days, there are no travel restrictions at all. If you want to travel, you just go travel. If you want to fly on Emirates upper, first class, I mean, like, help yourself. Like, we don't care. But at the end of it, you have to bring back receipts because we still have tax and we got to report and so on. And then they said, oh, and by the way, we're going to put all of these receipts up online so everybody can see them. So the little hypothesis they had there, because if you have an experiment, right, you have to have a hypothesis. So the hypothesis was transparency may be a better way of control than like rules and audits. And so what they found over the course of the experiment is in that treatment group, travel costs went down. They were just hoping they wouldn't go up much. They actually went down by 30% and engagement went up. And so, we just don't think often of how do I take a challenge, lack of empowerment, a noisome process. How do I do a little experiment, 30 days, 60 days, nothing that will blow the company up. We run it in parallel with the old. I use volunteers. So, you could sit with your team, whatever your unit, and you have this conversation. Guys, what is getting in the way of achievement? What systems, processes, structures, or leadership behaviors are at fault here? How might we change that? Can you imagine something we do in 30 to 60 days where we might be able to test a different idea? And so I think it's a good place to end here, Aidan, because I do think that every organization is in a race to the future. I think part of that race is building organizations that can thrive in a very difficult, high velocity world. Building those sorts of organizations is going to happen one experiment at a time. Now, you can accelerate that. We've used technology in companies where, in a period of a couple of months, we'll generate hundreds of experiments. And Roche might have moved a little faster if they'd done it that way versus in person teams and so on. I'm not sure. But it starts by recognizing that the pace at which my organization gets better is fundamentally determined by the number of experiments we run every year. How do we reallocate resources faster? How do we set bolder goals? How do we build more collaboration? How do we create a stronger sense of ownership? How do we give people the skills they need to use power effectively? And it's a race. And first you admit you have a problem, and then you say, I want to win. And then you unleash the imagination, the initiative in the organization. Say, guys, let's solve this problem together. And I think that was, again, the humility at Roche was, hey, we don't have an answer. We're going to figure out this thing together. Very few organizations in the world have ever done this. That's a huge opportunity for us. So every one of us in life, we have a choice. And in our organizations, we have a choice. Do we bitch or do we hack, right? Do we whine or do we experiment? And we just need a lot of more people who are willing to step up and help us build the future.
And thank you for encouraging everybody as well. I just pulled a final little piece here, my way of saying thanks to you as well. So, end of the book, Gary says, freeing the human spirit, that is the promise of humanocracy. With grit and determination, you can claim the promise for yourself, for your team, and for your organization. Like every epic quest, the journey will be arduous, but ultimately fulfilling. Now, this journey wasn't at all arduous, Gary, but it's been an absolute beautiful epic quest going through your full tome and even getting right up to date as well onto the latest edition of Humanocracy. And this is coming out right when that's coming out. So we could, and I didn't know that at the start. I have to tell our audience that I didn't know that was coming. So it came about absolutely beautiful, bit of serendipity. And Gary, I just want to say, man, it was an absolute pleasure. I know it's not going to be the last time we collaborate in some way in the future, but it's been hugely fulfilling, and I'm very grateful for you for joining us.
I'm very grateful as well, Aidan, and thank you to you for all the immense work you've put in. Thank you for everybody who's joined us in one way or other through the series. You know, my mission is to help us build organizations that allow people to thrive. And you can reach me on LinkedIn. You can reach me at GaryHamel.com. But yeah, let's hope that a few sparks are lit and that someone somewhere in the world can say, I'm living in an organization that's like just is feeling better every day.
And I want to tell you as well, last thing for me, Gary has been voted the world's top thought leader, by the way. It was only ever done once. It was done, and Gary was voted top thought leader in the world. So I want to tell you that an absolute pleasure it is having the world's best thought leader on this show, covering all his work, giving us all that time. Gary Hamel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to our sponsor, Kindle. You can find Kindle's brand new journal that features the world's top thought leaders on policy, on AI, on many technological shifts at www.kindle.com/institute.